When World of Warcraft's first expansion, the Burning Crusade, launched, the Draenei was added as a playable race on the side of the Alliance, and since their introduction just over 17 years ago, the Draenei has played a large role in many of the game's storylines, which are almost exclusively told during or after the Burning Crusade expansion. What many players don't know is that the race actually had a small presence in the game's original version, where it was even supposed to have its own faction, one that was all but removed, with its only remaining member being locked behind a few specific in-game items. This is the story of Vanilla WoW's hidden Draenei faction. When World of Warcraft's original version, which is known by most players as Vanilla or Classic, launched in 2004, there were already a lot of story relating to the Blood Elves, who would later become the 5th playable Horde race. But when it came to the Draenei, who would later join the Alliance, there were only a few references. And the first of these could be found in the Troll and Orc starter zone called Durotar, where inside a human settlement, low-level Horde players were able to read a book called The Rise of the Horde, where it's explained that the Horde killed nearly every Draenei on the planet of Draenor, while some of them managed to escape. And this was the first mention that players would see of the Draenei, and it didn't really explain anything about who or what they were. But on the other side of Azeroth, in the human town called Darkshire in Duskwood, Alliance players were able to read another book titled Kil'jaeden and the Shadow Pact, which explained that the Draenei was one of 2 races who inhabited the planet of Draenor along with the Orcs. These 2 books were initially the only direct mentions of the Draenei's history within the game, but as players reached higher levels and made their way into the Swamp of Sorrows and later the Blasted Lands, they met some creatures called the Draenei Exiles, who mainly resided in a village called the Harborage, where they offered quests for both Horde and Alliance players. In the just 2 quests they offered, it was explained that some of the Draenei, known as the Lost Ones, were driven mad during their journey to Azeroth. And the last of these quests sent the player out to recover stolen crystals, which could be found in the Lost Ones' main village called the Fallow Sanctuary, close to the Harborage. After returning these crystals, no further quests were given, and it wasn't explained what the crystals were used for. In the Blasted Lands, players met another Draenei called Komisha the Collector, who let the player turn in 2 crystal items, both of which had a chance to drop from creatures in the Blasted Lands, with the green fragments dropping fairly often, while the spheres had a very low drop rate. With the only exception being the dragon Teramos the Devourer, who would always drop a sphere. And just like previously, the purpose of the crystals weren't really disclosed, but it was hinted that they might be able to somehow help the Draenei return home. Strangely, the most detailed description of the Draenei's crystals weren't given by a Draenei, but instead the centaur Uthek the Wise, who was located on the other side of Azeroth in the Desolus zone. And during his questline, Uthek explains that the crystals don't originate from Azeroth, but from a place where mountains fly, and that they can be used to enhance magic. While no more references were made to the Draenei or their crystals at this time, they were actually supposed to play a larger role in World of Warcraft's first version, and going back to the late stages of World of Warcraft's beta, the Draenei used to be part of a neutral faction called the Moro'gai. The faction's main hub was the Harborage, where players could take up quests relating to Dragonscale leatherworking, which is one of 3 leatherworking specializations that players could learn during the game's original version, with most high-level leatherworkers choosing to specialize in tribal leatherworking because it allows them to craft the Devil Saw set. While all of the faction members were either removed from the game or lost their allegiance to the faction when the game launched, there were some remnants of the Moro'gai faction which could still be found in Vanilla. One of these was a Draenei leatherworking vendor who still occasionally sold the rare pattern called Green Dragonscale Breastplate, which, as the name suggests, required the player to specialize in Dragonscale leatherworking. The Draenei guards who patrolled the area were also still labeled as neutral, possibly because they used to be members of the Moro'gai faction, which players were innately neutral to. A few items related to the Moro'gai faction was also data mined, with a number of gems existing within the game files. When used, these would summon a Draenei called Alia, who was also a member of the faction. Alia would then follow the player as a companion and were possibly meant to offer quests, somewhat like the Frenzy Heart and Oracles faction from the Wrath expansion. Seeing as none of these items were available within the game, Alia has most likely never been summoned, unless a game master gave one of the items to a player by mistake, which is something that has happened for other unobtainable items a few times in the past, although extremely rarely. When the Burning Crusade expansion launched in early 2007, the playable Draenei race was introduced, and at the same time, additional information about the Draenei and their origins became available. And it turned out that the crystals which players were sent out to recover in vanilla didn't just serve one purpose, but instead powered most of Draenei society. Strangely, there were more variants of the Draenei crystals which were added to the game with the Burning Crusade expansion, but none of them ever dropped anywhere, and they weren't part of any content. At the same time, the story about the early Draenei found in World of Warcraft's first version also changed, and all of the exiles found in the Harborage were no longer called Draenei, instead being part of the Broken Ones, a devolved version of the Draenei that players came to know from most of the game's history. And while some members of the Broken Ones did go on to play important roles in the game's story, the original vanilla faction, along with their items, never became available, and were eventually removed from the game files at some point after the Cataclysm expansion.